Hi everybody, welcome to tonight's book launch. I'm absolutely so excited about tonight, so thank you all for being here. We are here to launch the new collection of poetry by Varney Anthony Ezekiel Capildeo, Like a Tree Walking. It's the Poetry Book Society Winter Choice this year for good reason, and Varney is here and they're going to read for us in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to just run over what's going to happen tonight. I know you're all well versed in the Zoom launch by now, but just so that we are all on the same page. We are also joined by Padraig Regan. So Padraig is also a poet. They're a poet from Belfast and they have published 2 pamphlets previously. The first is Delicious, which came out from Lifeboat in 2016, and then the second one from the Emma Press in 2017, Who Seemed Alive and Altogether Real. It's really exciting they're here because they also featured in our new Poetries anthology, which came out early this year in January, and their debut collection, Some Integrity, is coming next January, so next month, which is really exciting. So another favourite poet for your list, check out their work. You can read an amazing essay they wrote in PN Review, which is up on the website as well. So we're going to hand over to them in just 1 second, but before I do that, so you know what's going to happen, we're going to be together for about an hour. While Varney's reading, I'm going to have some text up on screen as a bit of a visual guide for you. If it doesn't feel right for you, just try to reconfigure your own screen, have a play around with it. You should be able to make it suit your needs. If you've got any problems throughout the event, just drop your messages in the chat box for us and we'll try and help you. The other thing that I want you to find, as well as the chat box, I can see loads of you have found that and you're saying hi, so that's really cool. Keep your messages coming, but please also find the Q&A button. Varney and Padraig are going to have a bit of a conversation about the poetry later on, and towards the end of the event we would love to have audience questions as well. Padraig can put them to Anthony and we'll take it from there. So if you get them lined up in the Q&A box for us, that would be really, really helpful. Final point before I invite Padraig on screen with me is just when you're using the chat, please make sure you've clicked on everyone so that everyone else can see your messages. Otherwise they'll just go to like me and Padraig and Anthony and you won't be able to have a conversation. So, okay, that's everything. Let's begin the book launch. I'm going to ask Padraig to join me on screen now.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It is such an absolute joy and a privilege to be here this evening to help usher this phenomenal new book towards its readership. I'm just going to say a few very brief words of introduction and then hand over to Varney. So I'm going to eschew the usual list of prizes and accolades that one often gives at these kind of events, partly because if I were to list all of Varney's incredible achievements, there wouldn't be a huge amount of time left for them to read. And partly because I don't think any of us who are here this evening really need to be convinced that Anthony Capildeo must now be considered one of the greatest poets currently at work in the English language. But, you know, as soon as I've said that, I find myself wondering really if either of those terms, poet or the English language, are quite capacious enough to accommodate the work of this incredible artist, who has, at my last count, produced 9 pamphlets and now 8 books, which include work that ranges from the lyric poem to essayistic prose, from typographical experiments to notes towards performance pieces and installations. And this seemingly endlessly multiple body of work is bound together not by anything so simple as a style or a mode, or even really a singular poetic voice, but by a spirit of restless heterogeneity and experiment. In the blurb for this new book, Like a Tree Walking, or Yet Like a Tree Walking, is described as a fresh departure, even for this famously innovative poet. And it is in many ways quite amazing that even here in book number 8, Capildeo is still pushing language into shapes that it has never quite inhabited before. In this book, we have lullabies and nocturnes and erasures. We have records of walks. We have prose poems in praise of trees, in praise of birds. And we have many other kinds of poem that I wouldn't even begin to know how to categorize. I want to just read a couple of lines from the end of the 4th part of the long prose poem In Praise of Trees. Here, Capildeo writes, "Gradually, the road traffic becomes a milky ribbon, east and west. Gradually, the bridge traffic becomes a flow to which my back is turned. Neither stream of traffic sound borders me in any way that constitutes my borders. Gradually, the clump of trees assumes me. And there's a lot to love in these lines. I think that idea of the traffic as a milky ribbon is just gorgeous. But the reason I wanted to read those lines is because I think they express the radical openness that runs throughout this book, a radical openness to the world, to experience, and to the other. And for me, it is this kind of unbounded openness that makes this book feel so particularly hopeful in our present circumstances, when, for many reasons, for our own protection, as a way of caring for each other, we've had to be so protective of our own personal boundaries and borders. But I don't want to intrude on these poems any longer than I have already done so. So the last thing I'm going to say is just please put your virtual hands together for Vanny Anthony Ezekiel Capildeo. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you so much for being here this evening. And thank you so much to Padraig for that wonderful introduction, which I dare not disagree with because I've never known Padraig to be wrong before. I'm going to begin by reading In Praise of Birds, a poem which had its origins in a collaborative experiment led by the poet Caroline Bergvall, where we were supposed to be responding to the old Irish poem Mad Sweeney, about the king who goes mad when he hears the ringing of a church bell and flies from place to place, landing including in Scotland at one point. And he has a long praise sections in that poem. And as my friend Selina Guinness, the novelist, remarked, mad in Mad Sweeney really means angry, not mad. But Caroline had assembled quite a lot of people to improvise on the basis of Sweeney, and we had to improvise while sound artists turned what we said into the language of twittering birds. So we were hearing our own language being played to us as vocalizations, and eventually we fell silent and let it take over. That's the origin of this poem. Now, for me, the best performance of this poem is not the one that I can possibly do because I don't write for my own voice. The best performance of this poem is one that I did, unfortunately, in my own voice, but wearing an extraordinary mask made by Eliza Ford, one of whose parents is in the audience, which transformed me into a colourful bird. And just before Trinidad was completely locked down, when I was in residence at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, I was filmed running around among trees, completely unrecognisable, I hope, in this mask, and reciting the poem. It's important to begin with praise. In praise of birds. In praise of high contrast birds, purple bougainvillea, thicketing the golden aureole. In praise of civic birds, vultures cleansing the valleys, hummingbird logos on the tails of propeller planes. In praise of adaptable birds, the herring gull that demonstrates its knowledge of how to use a box junction and seems to want to cross the road. In praise of birds eaten by aeroplane engines, in praise of birds trained to hunt drones, in praise of birds that, having nothing to do with human processes, crash aeroplanes. In praise of suicidal birds, brown ground doves forgetful of wingedness, in front of cars, slowly crossing the road. In praise of Perse birds like fish smashing out of a bowl. In praise of talk being cheap, and in praise of men who shut up about birds. In praise of birds of death and communication, Garud, the almost but more than an eagle vehicle of the darkly bejeweled and awfully laughing Lord of Death. In praise of badly drawn birds. In praise of white egrets sitting on mud, hippos, and lines about old age. In praise of old English birds of exile, the gannet's laughter, swathes of remembered seabirds booming and chuckling, the urgent cuckoo blazing on about summer, mournful and mind-blowing, driving the sailor over the edge towards impossible targets, scornful of gardens, salty about city life. I can't stand not setting off. Far is seldom far enough. In praise of a turn of good cluck, in praise of the high dancing birds carried on the heads of masqueraders and built by wirebenders to carry the spirit of an archipelago of more than 7,000 isles. In praise of grackles quarrelling on the lawn, in praise of unbeautiful birds abounding in Old Norse, language of scavenging ravens, thought and memory a treacherous duo. The giantess down from the mountain complained, I couldn't sleep in a coastal bed because of the yammering of waterfowl every morning that blasted seagull wakes me. In praise of the peacocks invading the car park at the Viking conference in York, warming their spread tails on the bodies of cars. In praise of the early bird who liberates the dewy worm from glaucous grass. In praise of birds of time-telling, green-rumped parrots for morning, kiskadees dipping at night, and the absence of birds of time-telling, the unrealed horror of humanly meaningless time. In praise of the bird of the soul that flies out when the body is molested, and in praise of that bird recalling the abuse room as if perched on the highest point of the pinewood press. In praise of the blue-black grass-queet, which is inky and small. In praise of the albatross, in praise of the double doors to a swimming baths hall. In praise of birds of concussion, notes in the air being all the brain can cope with. In praise of birds as edible, and in praise of birds as angels, and in praise of birds as stones, and in praise of Thoth the ibis. In praise of the birds of climate change, forest warblers bringing a new song to the suburbs, late leaving Arctic tern teenagers blizzarding the beach. In praise of ducking and diving, and without praise of the cruelty of quills. In praise of birds that are not punctuation, that are not calendars, that are not words. In praise of birds that occupy and disrupt a lyrical musical staff. In praise of birds that singing still do shitting ever singing, above a low-rent skylight on a diet of chips. In praise of triangulation and 3 unseen corncrakes, by whose calls guests may recognize the way to the house on the tipsy hill. Thank you. That's the first bit. The poem goes on quite a lot longer, and I will say that all the birds in this poem are real, but some of those birds go back to more than 20 years. Some of them are in medieval manuscripts, and some of them are in Inishbofin in the west of Ireland. I'm happy to answer questions about the reality of the origins of any of these poems, most of which won't be autobiographical, but I won't be able to answer questions about literary meaning or theology, because there are people in the audience who can do that much better than me. And so can Padraig. Okay, next one please, Jazz. So these plague poems, of which I'm not reading all, again aren't about me as such, and I wrote them all in one go, more or less. Trinidad's Prime Minister is a volcanologist by training, so he's trained in disaster preparedness and worked with people including the Archbishop, the Catholic Archbishop, and the military for community education and a very carefully calibrated plan of lockdowns. And I was very shocked by the different response that seemed to be happening in Britain, which I was observing from across the seas. Again, this is from a much longer sequence. It's dedicated to Jack, partly because of Jack's work with the homeless and vulnerable, which, not because anything in it is at all about Jack as such, but because without that I wouldn't have thought, for example, that closing off a park means closing off a place you can go to make a safe phone call if you're in a situation of domestic violence. Closing off a street means you can't get Wi-Fi to do your NHS or immigration forms if you can't afford Wi-Fi and so on. Anyway, that's a lot of preamble. Plague poems for Jack Belloli. 1. Now we are things invisible. The inessential park is closed, its benches clean of homeless bodies hurting less in sleep. Cigs, wasteful pansies, gratuitous marigolds, dogs running like flames and vaguely sinister statues are out like fountains in drought. The wrong romances will not fall among its turning leaves. Who'd make a fearful call, craving escape from beatings, can't expect to coast on help from public services. The sky is a roof only to birds and drones, no place to lose the words of crazy makers. You can grow your inward silence indoors now the inessential park is closed. Memory restyles it like a scroll, adding some willows and a bridge to which you run to catch a wish, the visible unusable park, its blue imagined bridge, for love of things invisible. Plague fidelity. You may kiss me as much as you like. I wish you would. I always wish you would. I wish you always would. You're the only one allowed to kiss me. The science's lack of touch can make you ill, even physically. Sometimes when you breathe, I start breathing just like you. Do you remember grandmothers? Poems about grandmothers. You said life's not like that. Could be. Remember asking, laughing, why I write, used to, about the sea? Kiss me. Tell me where you are. Thank you to the poet who remained nameless, who had a long phone call with his amicable ex in front of my study door, which kind of fed into this poem. Coronavirus swing. And this poem is silently inspired by Nikki Santilli, who is a prose poetry expert and also swing dancer. What's different? Why is it different? Why must we be when we are not? I'm beside myself. I'm with you. For social dancing, read social distancing. You alone do I adore. For catastrophe, read charity. For adventure, read attentiveness. Oh, baby, I mean it. For mask, read ring. Next page, please. Thank you. Nocturne number 6 comes from a series of 7 walks, 7 nocturnes, and 7 lullabies for Judy Raymond, among others. And Judy was somebody I walked with, taking more or less the same path around the Queen's Park Savannah in Trinidad and up Lady Chancellor Hill. And this partly was inspired as well by Unwalking, a project I've been carrying out with Harry Josephine Giles and Polly Atkin, where we look at the way that bodies that aren't expected in landscapes, whether they're disabled or of the wrong colour or the wrong sexuality or whatever, somehow make their way into landscapes and also find poetry there. And at first, Judy and I were afraid of the usual things like abduction and murder, which you get in the areas that we were walking. Later on, we were just afraid of breathing on each other because of the plague. And this one also is acknowledgement to St. John of the Cross. Nocturne number 6. Night, I'm not going to say you aren't there. You hurt my eyes with promises of rest. Stretch weighted blankets on warmed beds, under which the hills can crawl, starring out their masts, mansions, scars, and forests. You press hills into your dark like a brush, wetting paper with colour. You are high up and fluid. Night, I'm going to hold on to you today in daytime, in your absence, in your sharp absence. In bright fluorescence, I hold to you, surrounded by fluid darkness, indoors and out. In scathing sunlight, darkness nonetheless sheathes me, as if I lie down on air, high up. I have not been schooled to see like a scientist. Therefore I know your contours without having to touch you. and I know you're not there, not in that way. I am. Body of exhaustion, frequenting shops where natural tears are sold by formula with droppers, eyes dried by overwatching, overweeping. I am not like that night. I expected to break on you, holding on. The time for warning is done, night. Now is the time for joy. I'd like to commend to you also the work of Valgina Mort, M-O-R-T, An Extraordinary Report from Belarus, and it was my huge privilege to be able to read this among other poems in solidarity with the poets of Belarus at an event co-organised by Annie Rutherford of Edinburgh. Next one, please. Oh, also to answer a question about names, nobody can spell my given name and nobody can pronounce it. So I'm gradually switching to my baptismal names. And I don't think it's difficult for people to call me Anthony because the principal of my school was Sister Paul and the principal of the same school in my mother's time was Mother Frances Xavier. And I would be a terrible nun because I'm disobedient and old. And nonetheless, I don't think I have to be a nun to call myself Anthony. Nocturne number 7. Happy kilometres, happy sunflowers, happy Serpentine Road, Flood Street, Dry River, happy gang intervention, happy wedding, happy archbishop, happy oyster vendor, happy erased tramline, happy hospital, happy office block, happy gingerbread work, happy baobab, happy pitch oil rag flambeau, happy gecko alleluia, happy song. Next text, please. The next couple of texts, which I'm not sure why I'm inflicting on you, are from a series of Erasure poems from Dame Julian of Norwich's Revelations, where basically my procedure is to look at the texts until my eyes dazzle, and then I include only the words that seem to come towards me. Keeper. No, Laura, I can't inflict as many texts as I like because I really want to get around to hearing Padraig, which was one of my big treats of the last couple of years, hearing this most extraordinary thinker, Padraig. Keeper, little thing, oh, what is so little, very, so, a needy little creature, now love, how unmade is a so little, very small. Why so little thing? Oh, love, have rest. Next page. Thyself. Our full home, touching art, that is less full. If I want, I have all full and full touch the good creatures and work without need, only to store bliss, all this goodness. I really don't recommend looking at pages of text until they dazzle and erase themselves. It's very, very bad for your head. Next page, please. Now, this is when I thought that a friend in England or I might never meet again. And so I imagined meeting again. Oddly enough, not in the city where either of us lives. And I was very reconciled to the idea that one or both of us might die without meeting again. It struck me we'd had such a good friendship for half our lives. If there's an afterwards, I'll find you where we met, on stone-bright streets, I imagine. We may have lost people, not ourselves, not yet ourselves. If we have much to say, we do not say it. We have had years. A new friend is with us. New friends are hard to make in middle age. Who can introduce us? Silence runs like treacle over flint, coffee, river water, new words like petrichor, green willows, new words. If this were a sonnet we could turn, now I would turn, and I should have rhymed. I am without those things they say a poem needs. Sugar falls off a donut in a bag, in a rose garden, with a pack of cards. Next text. I'm not going to read all these trees. Okay. How are we doing? I hate the question, how are we doing for time? It's the wrong question, isn't it? I'm going to read only the first section because I will read another section this time later on, but I'd like to get on to chatting to Padraig, who's going to say all the things that I would have liked to know how to say. So these tree poems come from an exercise of stillness with trees, where you stand in the company of a tree. If you want to, you can close your eyes, and if it's safe to do so and you feel comfortable doing so. And you pay attention to the furthest sound that you can notice and just name it to yourself. And keep that there, and then notice the next furthest, the next closest, I should say, and then the next and the next and the next. And eventually you come into your body and notice the sounds of your body. And you are within this entire world of sound that is neither attention nor distraction. And what's curious about doing this, not as an individual stilling exercise, which is, I am told, an Ignatian practice, which I wouldn't know, but doing it rather as a dialogic exercise with a tree in the tree's microenvironment, is the tree both filters and bounces sound in ways you wouldn't expect. All these are real trees in Cambridge, and it takes about 2 weeks of hanging out with one tree to get 100 words out of it. Again, not really a recommendable method if you want any funding. I didn't have any. Tree of approximation. Listening to a tree with another person. Listening with a tree to another person. Listening or hearing. Who conducts attention to the rim of the sky? Start there. Start twice. And that is twice again. This time, the thick canopy of the marriage tree is rustling. My ears welcome and embrace the sound. It slips down much closer in hearing than sight would have allowed it to reach from the curve of leaves above. My eyes have closed, you see. My heart is thudding. My body knows that, not by sound. Small plants were trembling, I remember them, but they do not add in their small sounds. Footfalls one way, and a single dry leaf the other way, do skater tricks of sound, up and off from the ground, more volume in the air than you would think from looking at them. More than you would think from looking at them. We love this tree. And now over to the beautiful and soon-to-be deservedly illustrious Padraig.
Danny, that was absolutely gorgeous. That was such a beautiful reading, and I just want to say thank you so much for that. I have a few questions of my own that I want to put to you, but I'm going to say to the audience, if you do have any questions that you would like to put to Anthony, then please do use the Q&A box, and once I've gone through a few of mine, we will start going through those audience questions as well. So I wanted to begin by asking you about the title of this book, Like a Tree Walking, which, as far as I understand, is a sort of spin on verse 24, chapter 8 in Mark's Gospel, which is in the King James Version. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. And I think I saw a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, you described this as maybe your favorite simile that you've ever encountered. And I just wanted to begin by asking, well, first of all, what is it about that simile that you think makes it so incredible? And I think it is incredible in a lot of ways. And also why you thought it would make such an appropriate title for this book.
Could you read it again using the NRSV version? Sorry, I'm joking. Okay, so when I was very small, as in about 5 or 6, I used to bother my parents all the time to explain words in books that I was rampaging around reading. And so they taught me to use the proper concise Oxford English Dictionary, which meant that I started reading the Bible on my own and making up my own ideas of what it was about, such as that the cherubim in Ezekiel are God's terrible pets. That's one thing I was convinced of. And I also imagined like a tree walking. I had a disturbingly intense reaction to many of the trees that surrounded our house. There was a large shade tree, an umbrella tree, a saman, I can't remember its name in other languages, at the front of the house, which always seemed menacing to me and had a personality. And then later on, there were beautiful silvery trunked flame trees with canopies of red flowers and long cedar pods like cutlasses. And all of these trees had personalities for me. And I was perfectly convinced they could walk if they wanted to, and have never quite lost that sense. But then I don't want to explain what like a tree walking means theologically, because I'm not a theologian. But one question people might ask is if somebody who wasn't sighted was given sight as a form of healing, and we're not talking symbolically at all here. I'm not going to talk about inward vision or conscience or awakenedness to the interconnection of the world or anything else. If we're just talking about physical sight, does that mean it wasn't quite good enough? Does it mean that he got it back blurry, or was he blinking, or was he just getting used to it? You know, like when you are in a dark room and you go out into sunlight. Or I used to think really it is that he could see more than the rest of us could see, and that if you could see our auras, you would see us as various and flickering as trees with leaves are various and flickering, responsive to the wind, and in all these processes of being nourished by sunlight and, you know, connecting with each other through the mycelial network, that to see people as trees walking is to see them with that kind of density and complexity, and not to react to that with any kind of xenophobia or fear, but to take it as something natural and beautiful. And like a tree walking as well, because people tend to read me as a post-colonial poet or as a woman poet. So I don't write for myself or my own body. So one reason that I've started calling myself Anthony is to help people remember that I have a different identity from anything that I appear to be embodied as, because the mind can travel. And I like Anthony of Padua because he preached to the fish. And everyone should talk to fish sometimes.
I really love that thing that you said about you know, encountering this line in the gospel, and then being in a way kind of convinced the trees could actually walk.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they can walk. And I think Nabokov, who is not in some ways a recommendable writer, though very brilliant, that he talks somewhere, possibly in his short stories, Transparent Things, about trees changing their character at night. Claims that's the general Russian belief, but whenever people claim something as a general cultural belief, I think they've probably made it up. Anyway, jealous. Yeah, that they change the character at night and become sinister and intentional.
But I love how that story kind of speaks to that way in which, you know, I guess those kind of early metaphors and images through which we encounter things, I guess, sort of in our very early lives, in our childhood, when our sort of consciousness is just coming in or just beginning to develop, how that does absolutely change what objects fundamentally are, in some sense. That,
yes,
in a sense, you trees are things that are walking, are ambulatory, and that is, you know, isn't a connection that someone else, or isn't an understanding of the object of a tree that someone else wouldn't have if they hadn't come across that particular line, you know, at the time that you did.
Yeah, it's also quite a child's eye perspective, in that if you're small, people do look like trees. I mean, I'm not particularly tall, even in my grown life. And so quite a lot of people, I do have this slightly odd view of them, where their face is somewhere up there, like a tree.
So, and the other thing that I think is great about this title is that it really does tell us what to expect in the book, because both trees and walking are sort of recurring motifs that run throughout probably a majority of the poems in here. So I maybe wanted to start by asking about walking, and I guess how walking has become incorporated into your practice during the time that you were working on this collection?
Do you mean you're not going to ask me about failed love affairs, having babies, migration, citizenship, drinking?
No, I mean just sort of the very physical act of walking, because it does seem like like the kind of the physical
Yeah,
of walking is
there
important
is. I
in
mean,
ways
I
that a
think
lot of people
walking is really important. And I wrote, more seriously, I wrote an essay for Granta once about what I called micro travel, and how when you walk from one place to another, when perhaps like in many neighborhoods in Trinidad where I grew up, people are used to taking the car, you move through different zones, houses where people would let you in if you arrived in a car, you can ring the doorbell and they don't let you in because they assume someone arriving on foot is unexpected and undesirable, or suddenly you can be accosted in the street by the other people in the street, whether it's people who are begging or gardeners or vendors or whatever. You stop being of the car or of the inside of the house. I think that is quite important for a society like Trinidad's, which is both socially stratified and where public transport is very, very underdeveloped. It's like a kind of version of what people say about whether you look down or whether you look up, and what that says about the horizons of expectation of your imagination. Was you a person who raised that in Ulster Art Museum, I think, once, whether when you're looking at a landscape, whether it's done from the point of view of looking down or looking up? Well,
Oh, I think is this
because
the
being female bodied, I think I'm also supposed to be more afraid of walking around than I am, but I tend to not be as afraid of walking around as I should, because again, having grown up in Trinidad where lots of people have guns, the mere fact that not as many people have guns in Britain gives me the illusion of being much, much safer than I probably really am. So I feel able to walk around in the night on my own.
The other thing that I was thinking about with all the walking in this book is how I guess over the last couple of years, walking has become, I guess, much more important for a lot of people, because of the global pandemic, and because of the ways in which we've had to sort of change our leisure activities. So there was a time when simply going out for a walk would have been the highlight of the day for many of us, and this book is, I guess, sort of in some ways structured by the pandemic, although I know that there were big parts of it that were written prior to 2019, prior to 2020 and 2019. But there are also poems in here that look quite directly at the coronavirus pandemic. So I wondered if maybe you could talk about how, I guess, the pandemic has, in a sense, had a sort of structuring force over some of the work in this book.
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question. I was supposed to say that after every question, wasn't I? But I mean it. And well, one thing obviously is that walking is both unskilled and privileged. And it was very clear that I was privileged when I was locked down in Trinidad because there's a garden that runs all the way around the house. So when there was proper lockdown, I still could take walks. One, because of the garden. Two, I was privileged because I'm relatively able-bodied, though I'm somewhat visually impaired, so I have quite poor depth of field vision, which means I need to hold on to a thing or person if there are rapid changes of gradient underfoot or uneven surfaces generally, or at least to run a finger down the balustrade or something. Not a lot of people know that, but I'm noticing it more and more as I walk in more places. So I think one of the things that really structured the book isn't so much a before and after the pandemic, intensification during the pandemic, of reflecting on the different freedoms and unfreedoms that occur in different types of walking or journeying, if that makes any sense. So, for example, in the Windrush poem, which is a long 4-part poem developed in Leeds as a community project, thanks to Poet in the City and the British Library, there's the moment when I reflect on my apparently privileged position as the poet researcher, and I go into the British Library, but I immediately fail the bag check. I'm a suspect body in there, partly because of how I look, but also because, non-white, I don't look particularly middle class in some ways. And I probably had all sorts of stuff in my bag I shouldn't have had. Yeah. So there's that kind of thing of situating the walking poet in the poem, not as a kind of visionary bard who can just wander from battlefield to bower.
So the other thing that runs throughout this book is trees, and
Yeah.
trees recur continuously. And then there is this marvelous long prose poem towards the end of the book called "In Praise of Trees," and you read a section
Yes.
from it there. So I know that you talked a little bit about, I guess, your sort of process of engaging with trees when you were saying about that sort of listening practice.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit about when you sort of developed that technique and how you think that technique has perhaps allowed you access into, I guess, kinds of writing that perhaps you wouldn't have had without that process and that technique.
I became very interested in silence many, many years ago when I was doing very many years ago when I was doing my doctoral work in Old Norse. And I noticed Father Colin, it's the scarlet ibis. It's the national bird of Trinidad, and Andrew Latimer chose it. He's the designer for Carcanet. Andrew, I hope you're still using the pronoun he. And I mean, not in a normative way. I mean, I just hope I didn't misgender you. And a joke. And so yes, the cover is entirely due to the genius of Andrew Latimer, who does one beautiful cover after another with next to no input from me. It's a very edible pink. Sorry, it was a privileged answer to Father Colin. So, remind me, Padraig, what was I supposed to be talking about?
Trees.
I'm supposed to be talking about trees.
Yes.
Okay, so I was in Cambridge.
Sort of interaction with, I guess, the way it works in
Yes.
the Praise of Trees, but is that the tree becomes a kind of other, so that kind of open interaction with the other, and how that
Oh, that's a very good idea, open interaction with the other. So basically, I was interested in Old Norse in the spaces and texts where apparently something had happened, such as somebody had arrived at a decision to attack someone else, or to write a poem, or to turn into a werewolf or something, but that happens in the gaps of the narrative, and so it appears as a fait accompli, and a lot of the time commentators in 20th century criticism used to say that there was no emotion in Old Norse family saga prose, but I would argue that the emotion happens very traceably in a stylized progression of silence, which I analysed excruciatingly in my thesis, which nobody ought to read. And when I realised that I wanted to be baptised Roman Catholic before I died, because it was more or less what I believed, and I was increasingly aware that we die without any warning, as I've been telling my unfortunate collaborator all day today in New York, then it's just my usual cheerful sense in winter, being Scottish, then I started doing various exercises, and the stillness exercise, as I was saying, is based in Ignatian exercises, which I was doing because I really don't understand Jesuitical thinking at all, although I admire and respect it, it doesn't sit with my mind. So I started thinking that I can't really do these exercises on my own. What happens if I introduce a tree?
Mm-hmm.
It's less the openness of the other than my needing the tree to structure the world. If I wanted to be heavily theological about it, I don't want to, because Father Colin's in the audience who can tell us all about religious significances of trees, as indeed I'm sure you could. So it's more to do with creating a physical boundary, as well as the tree as interlocutor of some sort of open variety, that it delimits the soundscape in a particular way, and also I feel quite safe, as if the tree knows better than I do. That however weird my mind is being in processing sound, that the tree is actively creating this microenvironment of sound. A lot of my work has those sorts of pragmatic and silly at the same time origins, rather than anything deeper, which people like you kindly find after the fact.
Well, this is something that I've always really deeply admired about your work and about your practice as a poet, that it seems as though you are kind of willing to completely remake your own procedures and your own practice in relation to something or someone else, to some sort of other. And we see this in this book in poems like Stylish Deer, which remixes Ian Crichton Smith,
yes,
or those erasure poems. And they're also very, very different from each other. So I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit about I guess how you go about Well, I guess what I'm just trying to ask is, how on earth does one have the courage to be able to do that? To, be able to set aside one's own techniques, all those things that one has learned to really kind of, in what I think of as a very generous way to sort of surrender to this other object or other being or other person or other text.
I think it begins in a bad character because I often experience impatience and anger. And especially when I was studying literature, which is one of the reasons I did medieval studies in linguistics, was eventually becoming too angry and frustrated with modern works and how they were interpreted, as well as my just wanting to be able to read things in the original, because I kept wanting to say things aren't like that at all. I wasn't really sure how things were. So it feels less like courage than necessity, that things are otherwise, that I keep seeing them being represented in language. But to be able to fetch what that is, I have to go into a sort of state of internal silence. And what helped there was doing an online meditation with the Augustinians on interiority, not in the sense of being in a nice room like this, which I'm not going to show you because I'll probably smash something. It's York University chaplaincy have lent me their library, but the chaplaincy is being redecorated, so the table is full of extraordinarily precious glasswares and ceramics, which I will smash if I move more than 6 inches in any direction.
I think now it might be a good time to take some questions from the audience. And I want to start with this one from Jeremy Noel Todd, who asks, could you tell us about the pleasure of puns in poems? And then he mentions here a turn of good cluck.
Well, that's a wicked question because it's really testing the limits of my loyalty as a friend. So Jeremy Noel Todd is an eminent critic and academic whose doctorate was on T.S. Eliot, and who's also a very, very fine poet himself, though not publishing as much as I would like. And I've known Jeremy for most of my serious poetry writing life, and he's been extremely kind, reading everything I sent his way, which has been a lot. And Jeremy on Twitter used to run something called Pun Day on Sundays, and incite people to write in with ever wilder themed puns. So I think in certain ways, everyone of that generation who interacted with Jeremy on social media has some little room in their brains where there's a punster perpetually punning, and every often it just comes up. It's also to do with the way language unmakes and remakes itself, the way sound can be generative, but also the way I think that, and even in very serious moments, there can be something funny. The other thing is I also have a long-standing running joke about chickens with Jeremy, but I'm not going to say more than that. You just have, there's something about it in nearly every single one of my books, but you'll just have to look for it.
Well, that's someone's PhD thesis in a few years.
It is all true. It is all true. And I mean, I've hidden the chickens in all sorts of ways. There's no academic device which is too elaborate for you to uncover the traces of these fowl.
Mariam Hassavi has asked, Vani, I wondered about voice in relation to what you mentioned before you read. Do you feel you have a particular voice you've created which you wear and rewear as a sort of mask in the process of writing? Or does that voice arrive each time through the writing?
Yeah, look, I've got a teaching aid. Ask. And no, interestingly, it was just in a group discussion on community poetry and ethics. I can't remember whether it's one of the many, many things that people have told me is under embargo, so I can't tell you anything about it other than it was important and interesting. One of the things that it made me reflect on was the very different ways in which people use that word voice, almost as many ways as they use the word poetry. So first off, I never wrote for my own voice because I'm not particularly interested in it. And I like thinking that I can listen for or channel other voices like dead people and trees. And the second thing is that if by voice you mean something like an accent or a set of words or an idiom, then one of the particularities of Caribbean English, and particularly in a household such as the one where I grew up, is a kind of zigzagging where you can hear different dialects, different languages. You can hear a bit of Sanskrit, a bit of Spanish-based Creole. Somebody will come in with an accent that ultimately derives from West African Yoruba. Somebody will use translationese. I wrote about this in one of my pamphlets, Light Sight from Carcanet Press, where my late brother-in-law, a very holy man, spoke extremely broken English, but had a perfect command of Sanskrit and Sanskrit poetics. But when he wanted to translate from or explain Sanskrit, he would resort to kind of Victorian translationese.
Mm.
Because he either had the language of extolling and lotus-like and blooms, or he had dialect, or he had to think in Sanskrit and Hindi. There wasn't an innovative poetry, contemporary English for him to hold on to. So I think voice is always various. And this is why, for me, poetry has to begin with acts of listening into silence and to catch fragments of voice and never to write anything off as alien or distracting because you don't know what's going to give you the tune.
Here's a pretty fun question from Grania Tobin, who asks, I was surprised, never having heard Anthony Reid before, to find that humour and mischief are a conscious part of their approach to poetry. And then asks, is this a legitimate response? So do you think that humour, and especially I'm very intrigued by this idea of, do you think mischief is a sort of integral part of your poetics?
Absolutely. I think it's an integral part of more traditional Caribbean literature. Not that I want to give everything a kind of point of geographical or cultural origin, but there was a very good analysis of the much reviled V.S. Naipaul by his biographer, Padraig French, who observed that in some ways Naipaul, when he said horrible things, was being like the Trinidad Carnival traditional character, the Midnight Robber, saying what everybody hated and feared in grotesque and exaggerated forms, and waiting to hear who would challenge him. But people didn't respond in the masquerade way, and so he was left too much unchallenged. I think that willingness to be mischievous, you also find that in the Pierrot Grenade, which Robert Lee, the St. Lucian poet in the audience, who's a great expert in folklore, could tell you about. There are two kinds of Pierrots. There's the Shakespeare Pierrot in Trinidad, who can recite large amounts of Shakespeare beautifully, but there's also Pierrot Grenade, the simple Pierrot, the fool, who puns a lot and respells words by misspelling them, and is a corrupter of words, a deformer of language, but for joy and pleasure, not for anything degrading or perverse. Mm-hmm. In a way, it's an act of colonial resistance, but it's also an act of sheer human joy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I would like to say one other thing in answer to that, though, which is that often if a poet is brown or appears to be female or has had bad things happen to them in the past or anything, or any of the other categories that fall into, you're not supposed to be able to make jokes. And very often I've had the dismaying experience of appearing on a stage and the person announcing me sounds as if they're announcing my funeral, not my poetry reading. Then nobody in the audience knows if they're allowed to laugh. I think this is a sad state of affairs.
Well, I would say I had many laughs during your reading.
Yeah, but look at where you're from. You know how to laugh. You really know how to laugh. Yeah.
There's a question here from E2, which I wanted to ask because it was something I had also been intending to ask you about myself. And they say, I'm really intrigued by the subsection titled No Metaphor, and asks if you could talk about the poetic alternatives to metaphor.
All right. Well, first off, I'd like to recommend the work of Padraig Errington, Errington, the Western Canadian poet, currently resident in Edinburgh, who's doing some very fine work on metaphor. So that's, I mean, Patrick will be able to, not Padraig, but Padraig Errington will be able to point you to what metaphor is. Secondly, the source of No Metaphor is that same Ian Crichton Smith poem, which you can buy as a separate book from Carcanet down the high hills. Not that I'm plugging it, that's one of the best things I've ever read. Where there is no metaphor is a refrain in the poem. And something I love about Crichton Smith is the way he brings us up against the particularity, the grand itness of the other forms of life that we share this planet with, how we're connected to them, and they have this sort of abounding life that we can witness and that we participate in but can't fully comprehend. And say he does something quite mischievous in There on the High Hills. You never know if it's incantatory and bardic or if it's also a bit mischievous. He's got a whole section of that poem where he just says things like, the sun is sunny, or the stone is stony. You know, what is the guy doing? He's been using very high language before that, but he is bringing words down to sort of slap them up against the things, and it never quite fits, but there you are.
There's a couple of questions here that I'm going to try to roll into one from Kate Arthur and Maureen Boyle, who are both asking about the Julian of Norwich erasures, which I do just want to say are not the only erasures in this book. There's another sequence of them about or from the work of Simone Weil. So Kate asks, how does the voice of the Julian of Norwich erasure poems relate to the revelations of divine love as a whole? And also asks, do you find that her voice, that Julian's voice, is still a sort of whisper in your own mind, even, you know, having since finished that project? And then Maureen Boyle is asking, I guess, a bit more generally about to what extent do you see your writing as close to mysticism or as working within the mystical tradition?
No, I don't work within the mystical tradition. I have no idea whatsoever what the mystical tradition is. I have a terror of mysticism, and I would like everything to be footnoted in lists. This may be a lie that I may have to take to confession, but if you want to know about mysticism, I can comment you in the audience, Meg Chin from California, who knows absolutely everything in more languages than I can remember. This is actually true. I'm phoning a friend, Mike. And then, no, do I write in the tradition of mysticism? No.
The other part of that question was, I guess, about Julian of Norwich's voice and whether
it was. I'm just trying to think about that and that curious word whisper, because the way I should say it started visiting Norwich in my 20s, initially to visit the Todd family, Jeremy Noel Todd's family, and later on I just started going because I fell in love with the Flints, particularly Norwich Cathedral. And if anybody has a direct line to make me poet in residence living in a hovel in the ground of the cathedral, I absolutely seriously would take that, because I've been writing about it without the cathedral noticing for a good 20 years. Funding, please. And I'm better at this. I'm getting much better at, if not funding, just a hovel. I just want to live near the Flints. And so yeah. I've had Julian of Norwich's voice sort of flooding me, and as a touchstone in my own life, I've kept on revisiting the cathedral and looking at the rather wonderful statue of her by the entrance door, the west door, where you can see her holding a book. It's great to see a statue of a woman author holding a book on the front of such a grand cathedral. So, yeah, I would engage with that rather as flood more than whisper. It's more like, when am I not hearing Julian of Norwich? Which isn't to say that I agree with everything that she seems to think in either the short or the long text, but just that she's there. And one of the things I most like is how she changes scale, because to me that's very important if we're to have a truly ecological perspective. So getting away from theology, which I know nothing about, more or less, except everything I ought to know from having been catechized, then what fascinates me with Julian is that when she talks about flooding and blood, she can talk about the flooding of blood from wounds in a human body. Of course, a wounded human body we can relate to trees in certain ways, but she can also relate it to things like chaos and creation and destruction of the world. So similarly, she can look at the hazelnut and think of the entire cosmos as being like a hazelnut. She packs everything into the small kernel, and that ability to move scale and yet to see something about the inward multifarious form of things is one of her great strengths. And I think to see ecologically, we need to be able to see that.
I thought you'd like to know Tiffany Atkinson, who is a really wonderful poet in Norwich, has said that she is working on the cathedral thing. So there you go. Okay, we're
Also,
just
if anybody else gets the cathedral before me, I am going to duel them and they will lose.
We've just gone past 8 p.m, so we really probably
Yeah.
should move towards wrapping up. I know that there are a number of questions left in the Q&A that we haven't got to yet, and for that I apologize.
I'm so sorry, it's my fault. I'm talking too much.
No, your answers have been marvelous. I believe you had one last thing that you wanted to read for us, and then we can pass back to Jasmine to finish the event.
Actually, I don't have one last thing I want to read. I'd rather just answer a question. Do you want?
Okay.
It's much fairer. It's much more democratic. And there's also loads of stuff loads of me reading on the web.
Okay, this will be a nice one to finish on. Joanna Guthrie asks, do you have a particular species of tree which you feel to be a particular companion to you, or is it more about individual trees themselves?
I have to say that if anyone is attempting to cast a spell on me for any purposes, having been baptized, I'm absolutely immune to witchcraft. So don't try. No, not if I had a totem tree, I'm definitely also not going to tell you. And and then, sorry, that's a beautiful question, but unfortunately, no. I also can't tell you what my favorite color is. I have no idea what my favorite food is, and I don't even know what my favorite animal is. My mother is similar to me in this, that we tend to be very context bound and concrete. My favorite animal is probably just whichever dog is next to me at the moment. For example, the trees is interesting because once I was commissioned to write on any picture I wanted whatsoever in the Tate galleries, in any Tate gallery, and so I walked around two of the Tate galleries, and although there were lots of pictures I liked, in the whole of both Tates in London, the only four I could have written about, only four that seemed to stir something that I could reach to through the silence. So what I like or feel kin to, and what stirs to find form in words are not the same thing. And so when I was looking at these trees, which are all around Cambridge, and which I discussed with people like Hope Doherty, Paige Smeaton, who formerly were at Cambridge, Father Dominic, and Sister Rose, who are at Cambridge now, very fine and artistic Dominicans, I realised that although there are lots of trees I love around Cambridge, there were only a few that spoke to me, and one or two of them were actually very unremarkable and scraggy. One particularly scraggy tree on the Huntingdon Road, and nonetheless was eloquent.
And there's no way, I guess, of predicting in advance, or which one might speak to you and which one wouldn't, and there's nothing.
No. I tried to take walks in my mind as I tried to visualize. This is another reason I could never be a Jesuit. I tried to visualize myself into places that I knew very, very well, and mocked up excellent four-dimensional scenarios in which I had poetic reactions to beautifully photogenic trees. And then the moment I found myself actually in those environments, entirely other trees were speaking to me.
And thank you so much. I think we really do need to leave it here because we've already gone a little bit over time.
Yes.
Otherwise, I could talk all evening. I just want to say thank you so much for the reading, for your fascinating thoughts in response to our questions afterwards. Everyone who is here should go out and buy this book or order it online direct from Carcanet. It is an absolute work of majesty. I've been reading it, I think, for about a month now. And I know that I have barely scratched the surface of the thinking that is in this book, and that this book will be keeping me company for months to come. Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you to everyone for coming out. I'm going to pass over to Jasmine. But if you would please put whatever last messages of support and thanks you want to into the chat. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all for being here. It's been really, really gorgeous. I'm just going to reiterate Padraig's last message there. Please go and buy the book. The link is in the chat for you, and you'll get your discount code there as well. It will come as an email tomorrow. So if you can't find the message in the chat right now, don't worry. Get in touch with us if you have any problems. I should say that because of Demon Brexit, I'm really sorry that we can't actually sell books to the EU at the moment, but you can buy our books in your bookshops there, so you can go and buy Varney's new book there. And if you're hoping to buy books for Christmas, please do get your orders in by December 13th, otherwise we can't guarantee they'll get there. So when you're ordering your hundreds of copies of Varney's new book to give to all of your friends and family, do it right now, is basically what I'm saying. So yeah, again, thank you very much. Please join us next week. We're launching Paul Batchelor's new collection. He's going to be joined by John McAuliffe, and they'll be talking about the Acts of Oblivion then, and all the details are on our website. So thanks again, everyone, and congratulations to Varney, and thanks, Padraig, for this beautiful evening. Good night.